He ruled the Callaway Financial District the same way he ruled everything else. Without apology, without hesitation, and without the faintest interest in what anyone thought about it. Everett Dane had built Dane Capital from a single borrowed office on the 42nd floor into the kind of institution that made senators nervous and rival CEOs cancel vacations. He was 41 years old, had never lost a hostile acquisition, and was rumored, in the circles that traded in such rumors, to have personally arranged the financial ruin of 3 men who had tried to take something that belonged to him. He was not a man who waited, so when the elevator to the executive suite opened at 8:47 in the morning, and he stepped out to find the hallway empty, his new contract accountant not at her desk, and the Mercer file still sitting closed on the corner of what was supposed to be her workspace, the temperature in the room dropped without anyone touching a thermostat. His assistant, a trim young man named Wesley, who had lasted 4 months longer than anyone expected by learning to read the exact pitch of silence, Everett Dane used right before someone got fired, appeared at the end of the hallway with a tablet pressed to his chest. "She called up from lobby security," Wesley said, not quite meeting his boss's eyes. "The badge system flagged her as a contractor, so they held her downstairs for verification. She's been there since 8:15. Everett looked at the empty desk, then at Wesley. "Get her up here," he said, and walked into his office. Bridget Callum arrived on the 47th floor at 8:52, with a lanyard, still half unclipped from her collar, a tote bag that was clearly carrying more than one laptop, and the particular expression of someone who has decided, somewhere between the lobby and the elevator, that they are not going to let this ruin their morning. She was 31 years old. She wore a charcoal blazer over a soft cream blouse, dark trousers with a pressed crease, and sensible flats that had seen better years but were still trying. She was full-figured in the way that made certain kinds of offices assume things about her before she opened her mouth. And she had learned, over a decade in forensic accounting, exactly how long to let people assume before she corrected them. She set her bag down at the assigned desk, pulled out her laptop, and had it open and connected to the network in under 2 minutes. The Mercer file was where she'd been told it would be. She opened it. She was 7 pages deep into the subsidiary ledger when the office door opened and Everett Dane walked out. She had read the file on him the same way she read every client file before a placement, thoroughly, without sentiment, and with particular attention to the things people chose not to mention. What the briefing documents said: CEO 41, built Dane Capital over 15 years, aggressive M&A record, 0 tolerance for error. What the briefing documents didn't say but the financial audit trail implied. If you knew how to read it. Dane Capital's acquisition strategy had a pattern that didn't quite match its public profile, and at least 2 of its subsidiary holding companies were structured in ways that made a careful accountant want to ask careful questions. Bridget Callum was a very careful accountant. She looked up from the ledger when she heard him approach, because it seemed rude not to, and found him already looking at her with the particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with interest and everything to do with assessment. "You're the accountant," he said. "Bridget Callum," she said. "Yes. You were late. I was held in your lobby for 37 minutes because your badge system doesn't have a contractor verification protocol that functions before 9 a.m. She kept her voice even. "I arrived at 8:15. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, shifted, like a calculation being revised. "The Mercer file," he said. "I'm in it now." He looked at the open laptop, then at her. "You've been here 8 minutes, 7 actually. The subsidiary structure on the Mercer acquisition has a gap in the Q3 reconciliation that I want to understand before I touch anything else. Is there a contact at Mercer who can pull the original escrow documentation, or does that come through Wesley?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Bridget had counted silences like this one for most of her adult life. She knew the difference between the silence of someone deciding whether to be angry and the silence of someone recalibrating entirely. She waited through it without looking away, because looking away in the first 10 minutes of a placement was how you spent the rest of the engagement being ignored. "Through Wesley," Everett said finally. "Thank you." She looked back at the ledger. He stood there for another moment. She could feel it without seeing it. And then he walked back into his office and closed the door. Wesley appeared at her elbow approximately 30 seconds later, wearing the expression of a man who has witnessed something he cannot quite classify. "Has he already made someone cry?" Bridget asked, not looking up. "Not yet," Wesley said. That's kind of rare. I'll need the escrow documentation from Mercer, the original closing statement, and whatever internal memo authorized the Q3 adjustment. Can you get those?" "I'll have them in an hour. 30 minutes would be better." Wesley went to get them in 30 minutes. The thing about Everett Dane, the thing that didn't make it into the briefing documents, the profile pieces, or the careful rumors that circulated in rooms he owned, was that he noticed everything. He had built his life on it. On reading a room before he entered it, on understanding what a person wanted before they asked for it, on seeing the one detail that everyone else had agreed, collectively, not to look at. It was not a skill he had learned. It was something older than that, something that had kept him functional in environments where inattention cost more than money. So he noticed Bridget Callum. He noticed the way she moved through his office, quietly, without asking permission, without announcing herself. He noticed that she had not apologized for being late. He noticed that she had identified a discrepancy in the Mercer file that his own internal audit team had flagged, reviewed, and apparently decided was not worth escalating in the time it had taken him to walk across his own hallway. He noticed, when he brought her a second coffee at 11, an action that surprised him even as he did it, that she had covered 3 pages of a legal pad in a handwriting so small and precise it looked mechanical, and that she did not look up when he set the cup down because she was finishing a thought and the coffee would still be there when she was done. He had not brought anyone coffee in this office in 11 years. He told himself it was because she was useful. That was probably true. He was less certain it was the whole truth. She found the second discrepancy at noon. It was smaller than the first. A rounding adjustment in a subsidiary transfer that had been buried 3 layers deep in a holding company that had a name that sounded innocuous and a structure that was not. The kind of thing that could be explained in 3 different ways, only one of which was innocent. Bridget sat with it for a while. She had been placed at Dane Capital by her firm for a standard 6-week forensic review in advance of the Mercer merger. Her job was to reconcile the books, flag discrepancies, and produce a clean report. Her job was not to speculate about why a CEO with Everett Dane's profile was running money through a shell structure that didn't need to exist. She flagged it in her notes. She kept working. At 1:15, Everett came out of his office, looked at her desk, and said, "You haven't taken a lunch break. I'm in the middle of something. There's a cafe on the 39th floor. I brought lunch." She nodded at the paper bag tucked beside her tote. "I'll eat it at my desk." "That's not." He stopped. Bridget looked up. It was the first time she had seen him without a complete sentence, and it's complete interesting. "Not what?" she said. "Standard," he said, recovering. "The building has a lunch protocol for contractors." "I wasn't aware a lunch protocol was in my contract." She held his gaze. "Is it mandatory?" He looked at her for a moment that went a half-second longer than professional. And then he said, "No," and went back into his office. She ate her lunch at her desk. It was a very good sandwich. She had made it herself. The crisis happened at 3:47. It arrived in the form of Wesley moving fast down the hallway, which was never a good sign, followed by 2 men in suits who had the particular bearing of people, accustomed to being the most dangerous people in whatever room they entered. They were not, in this case. The most dangerous person in this room was currently in his office with the door closed. Bridget looked up from the Mercer file. The two men stopped when they saw her. One of them, taller with a jaw like a geographic feature, looked at Wesley. "Who is this?" "Contract accountant," Wesley said. "She's cleared. She shouldn't be up here. She has a signed NDA and executive-level access." "Mr. Dane authorized." "Mr. Dane can speak for himself," said Everett Dane from the doorway of his office. The two men shifted their weight in a way that was trying to be subtle and wasn't. The taller one said, "We have a situation with the Renault account. It needs to be handled in private." "Then handle it in my office," Everett said. "Mrs. Callum, take your break." Bridget saved her work. She stood, picked up her coffee cup, and walked toward the small break room at the end of the hall, with the unhurried manner of someone who has been excused from many rooms over the course of a career, and has long since stopped being offended by it. She was 3 steps from the break room door when she heard one of the men say, very clearly, "The Renault exposure has been traced. If the auditor finds it." The door to the break room swung shut behind her. Bridget stood in the small, quiet kitchen. She looked at her coffee cup. She thought about the subsidiary structure she had found that morning, the rounding adjustment at noon, and the name Renault, which did not appear anywhere in the Mercer documentation she had been given, but which she had seen once in a footnote in one of the holding company filings she had pulled for context. She refilled her coffee. She went back to her desk. She did not mention what she had heard. But that evening, when she was alone in the office and the 47th floor had emptied out, she pulled up the holding company filing again and looked at the Renault footnote for a long time. The second week was different, not in any way that could be pointed to specifically. The work was the same. The office was the same. Wesley still appeared at her elbow, with documents she needed before she had finished asking for them. But Everett Dane had shifted in some way that she couldn't quite name. He came out of his office more, not constantly, not intrusively, but in the way that someone moves through a space differently when they're aware of another presence in it. He asked questions about the Mercer reconciliation that were sharper than they needed to be, if he were only monitoring progress. Questions that told her he had read whatever she had produced the previous day and thought about it overnight. On Wednesday of the second week, he sat down across from her desk and looked at the legal pad she had covered in 2 days of notes. "You write everything by hand first," he said. "I think better in handwriting." "Why?" She considered this. "It slows me down enough to catch things I'd miss if I were typing." He looked at the pad. "What did you catch today?" She turned it to face him. "The Mercer Holding Company in Delaware has a secondary registration in Nevada that isn't reflected in any of the documentation I was given, which means either the due diligence package I received is incomplete, or someone pulled the Nevada entity from the disclosure intentionally." Everett looked at the legal pad. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "Where did you find the Nevada registration?" "Public Records, Secretary of State database." She folded her hands on the desk. "I pull everything I can find publicly before I start working with what I'm given. It helps me know what I'm not being shown." The silence this time was 6 seconds. She counted. "That's not standard practice," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's mine." He looked at her for a moment that was beginning to feel like a habit for both of them. Then he said, "The Nevada entity is legitimate. I'll have documentation sent to you by end of day." "That would be helpful," she said. He stood. He picked up her coffee cup, empty, as it always was by mid-afternoon, went to the kitchen without comment, refilled it, and set it back on her desk on his way back to his office. She looked at the coffee cup. She looked at the closed office door. She went back to the legal pad, the thing that Bridget Callum had never said to Etienne Minoan, not to colleagues, not to the therapist she had seen briefly after her last relationship ended, not to her sister who called every Sunday and asked careful questions, was that she had spent most of her adult life trying to take up less space, not in the way that people meant when they said it colloquially, literally, physically. She had spent years learning to move through rooms without being noticed, to speak only when she had something worth saying, to dress in neutrals and keep her bag tucked close and sit in chairs with her shoulders curved inward, as though she could will herself into a smaller outline. She was good at her job in a way that certain kinds of clients never quite saw, because they were too busy looking at the other things: her size, her age, the way she took notes by hand, the sandwich she ate at her desk, the things that announced, to people who had decided not to pay attention, that she was not someone worth paying attention to. It was a useful invisibility. It was also exhausting. On Thursday of the second week, she was in the break room making her second coffee of the afternoon when she overheard two of the junior analysts. Young men who had clearly not realized the break room didn't have the sound insulation they imagined it did. Talking in the hallway, the contractor up on 47. "I know, I saw her. What do they need her for? The internal team could have. Dane likes her, apparently." A pause. "Her? Really? That's what Wesley said. I mean." A low laugh. "Okay, different strokes." Bridget poured her coffee. She stirred it slowly. She looked at the small window in the break room that looked out over the west side of the city, 60 stories of steel and glass laid out in the afternoon light, and she breathed through the familiar slow burn in her chest that she had learned, over 31 years, to simply wait out. She was waiting it out when the break room door opened. Everett Dane walked in, saw her, and then, in a way that told her he had heard at least part of the hallway conversation, looked at the wall beside the window instead of at her face. "The Nevada documentation came through," he said. "I saw it. It addresses the registration question." She kept her voice level. "Thank you." He poured himself a coffee. He did not leave. "You heard them," he said. "It was not a question." "It's not the first time," she said. "It won't be the last. I've learned to let it go." "You shouldn't have to." "No," she agreed. "But that's a different conversation." He turned then and looked at her, and it was different from the assessments he had run on her in the first week. Sharper in some way, less like he was cataloguing her usefulness, and more like he was looking at something that had made him reconsider a position he'd held for a long time. "The Mercer file," he said after a moment. "You could finish it in 3 weeks if you wanted to. You're pacing yourself." "I'm being thorough," she said. "You're also not showing me everything you've found." He held her gaze. "I know what thorough looks like. I've hired thorough. What you're doing is something else." The silence was very long this time. Bridget looked at her coffee. "I found something in the first week," she said carefully. "I'm not certain yet what it means. When I'm certain, I'll bring it to you. And if what it means is something I don't want to hear, then," she said, "you'll hear it anyway. That's what you hired me for." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and walked out of the break room. Bridget exhaled. She finished her coffee. She went back to her desk. She found the full shape of it on Friday afternoon. It had taken her 11 days of careful, incremental work, pulling threads from 3 different holding companies, cross-referencing public filings with internal ledgers, tracing a money trail that had been deliberately obscured, but not, crucially, obscured by someone who expected anyone to look this carefully. The Renault account was a pass-through, money moving from Dane Capital's legitimate operations into a holding structure that had, over the past 4 years, quietly absorbed the assets of 6 smaller companies in ways that didn't show up cleanly in any single audit, because no single audit had ever looked at all 6 simultaneously. It was not, technically, illegal. It was the kind of structure that existed in the permanent gray zone between aggressive financial strategy and the sort of thing that made regulators want to have a very long conversation. It was also, she was now fairly certain, the kind of structure that had been built by someone who knew exactly where the lines were and had made a deliberate choice about how close to approach them. She sat with it for a long time. Then she knocked on the office door. "Come in," Everett said. She walked in, closed the door behind her, and set the legal pad on his desk. 15 pages, covered in her small, precise handwriting, with 3 pages of supporting documentation, flagged with colored tabs. "Sit down," she said. He looked at the legal pad, then at her. Then he sat. She walked him through it, all of it. The Renault pass-through, the 6 subsidiary absorptions, the Nevada registration that was legitimate, but that had been used as cover for 2 of the transfers, the Q3 adjustment that wasn't an error but a choice. She spoke for 22 minutes without stopping, without softening, without the careful professional hedging she had learned to use when delivering findings to clients who didn't want to hear them. When she finished, the office was very quiet. Everett was looking at the legal pad. His jaw was set in a way that she recognized. Not anger at her, but the particular controlled stillness of a man who is processing something faster than he wants to show. "You've had this for how long?" he said. "The full picture?" "Since this afternoon. The pieces. Since day 2. And you waited. I wanted to be certain. And I wanted." She paused. "I wanted to understand what it meant before I told you what it was. There's a difference between finding something and knowing what you're looking at." He looked up from the legal pad. "What are you looking at?" he said. "Someone who built something very sophisticated," she said, "and either doesn't know or doesn't care that it's starting to become visible." She held his gaze. "The Mercer acquisition will put a second set of eyes on every one of these structures. If the due diligence team is any good, they'll find at least 2 of the subsidiaries. And if they find 2, they'll pull the thread." The silence stretched. "What would you recommend?" he said. She had not expected that question. Or rather, she had expected some version of it, but not asked in that tone. Direct, without performance, without the slight defensive edge that most clients brought to the moment when they realized she knew more about their books than they'd planned for. "Restructure the Renault pass-through before the Mercer team starts their independent review," she said. "Clean documentation on the 6 subsidiaries, not to change what happened, but to make the rationale legible. If someone asks a question, the answer should exist in writing, and it should be accurate." She paused. "The structures themselves are defensible. The obscurity is not." Everett looked at the legal pad for a long moment. Then he said, "You could have taken this to the Mercer team directly. As the independent auditor, you had standing." "I know." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was hired to audit Dane Capital's financials," she said. "Not to decide what to do with what I found in them. That's your decision. I found it. I'm telling you. What happens next belongs to you." He was very still. "Most people in your position," he said slowly, "would have seen this as leverage. I'm not most people." "No," he said, and something in his voice was different. Lower, less controlled, like a layer had been removed from it without his permission. "You're not." She picked up the legal pad. "I'll write the formal recommendation by end of day Monday. You'll want your legal team to review it before anything moves." She was halfway to the door when he said, "Bridget." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her first name. "The 2 men you saw in the hallway last week," he said. "Renault. You heard the name?" "Yes. You didn't ask me about it." "No." "Why?" She turned. "Because it wasn't mine to ask about yet, and because I've learned that the questions you don't ask too early are the ones that get answered honestly." He held her gaze across the length of his office. 40 feet of expensive floor, the city laid out behind him, in the last light of a Friday afternoon, everything very still. "The restructuring," he said. "It will take someone who already knows where everything is." "Yes," she said. "How long would you need to extend the engagement?" She considered. 8 weeks, maybe 10. "Done," he said. "Whatever your firm requires." She nodded. She turned back toward the door. "The analysts," he said. In the hallway on Thursday. She stopped again. They don't work here anymore. She stood very still for a moment. That wasn't necessary, she said. Yes, he said quietly. It was. She didn't answer that. She walked out of his office, down the hallway, back to her desk. She sat down. She looked at the city through the window. All that light, all that distance, the whole ordered architecture of the world she had spent her career moving through without quite being seen. She thought about a man who had built an empire on noticing everything, and who had, apparently, noticed her. She opened her laptop. She began to write the recommendation. Monday morning, she arrived at 8:14. The badge system processed her contractor credentials in 11 seconds. She stepped off the elevator on the 47th floor and found that someone, Wesley, she assumed, and then wasn't sure, had put a coffee on her desk. Still hot, Everett Dane was already in his office. Through the glass, she could see him at his desk, reading something, his jacket on the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled to the elbows in the way she had learned, meant he had been there since before 7. He looked up when she sat down. She lifted the coffee cup in a small acknowledgement. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, unguarded in a way that she suspected very few people ever saw from him. And then he looked back at whatever he was reading. Bridget set down the coffee, opened her laptop, and pulled up the recommendation she had written on Friday evening, in the quiet of her own apartment, at the kitchen table, with the same careful handwriting that she used for everything that mattered. She read it once more. She pressed send. 3 minutes later, his office door opened. There's a conference room on the 44th floor, he said. My legal team will be here at 9. I'd like you in the room. I'll be there, she said. He nodded. He started to go back into the office. Everett, she said. He stopped, turned. It was the first time she had used his name. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the suggestion of something that had not been permitted in that face for a long time and was now carefully being allowed. The documentation was thorough, she said. You built something that would have held for years if nobody looked hard enough. But you looked hard enough. I always do. He looked at her for a moment that was different from all the others. Longer, quieter, more honest. I know, he said. He went back into his office. The city outside the window was very bright. Bridget Callum looked at her laptop screen, then at her legal pad, then at the 47th floor laid out before her. The whole complex, careful, extraordinary world she had spent 11 days learning to see. And for the first time in a long time, she did not try to make herself smaller than she was. She picked up her pen. She began to write.